The owner so far has not claimed Dulcie, so she's going to be looking for a home, hopefully. She's going to need to be adopted.
Very beautiful little orange tabby girl. And this is little Missy, and she is a female domestic short-hair tortie. She was an owner surrender, and she's about...
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this continued hearing of the Budget and Finance Committee of the Mayor's proposed budget for fiscal year 2014-2015. I'm Paul Krikorian, Chair of the committee. I'm joined by my colleagues, Council members Mike Bonin, Paul Koretz, Bob Blumenfield, and Mitchell Englander, and we are ready to begin with consideration of the Chief Legislative Analyst's recommendations based on the motions, discussions, and reports that this committee has considered over the course of 6 separate days of hearings of the budget. And I want to take a moment just first of all to thank my colleagues on the committee, because I think that this process has been tremendously productive. We've spent over 30 hours of debate and testimony in consideration of the budget, and the result of that consideration has been the proposal that you have before you, the report of the CLA that you have before you now, and we'll hear that in detail in a moment. But I want to say just at the outset, we will be taking general public comment on this matter. We have quite a number of cards. I'm going to allow 1 minute per speaker. We have had general public comment at each and every meeting. In fact, sometimes several times during that meeting. So we've more than we've had a tremendous amount of input from the public already. But I do want to afford another opportunity for those who are here today to comment on the CLA proposal before you. This proposal is the net result of all of those 6 meetings, the discussions that we've had, the motions that we've made, the reports that we've sought, and then over the course of the last several days, and let me say with regard to the motions, the reports rather, we had 200, I think, more than 200 requests for reports back. So let me again thank the CAO staff and all of the departmental staff who worked exceedingly diligently to get back a huge notebook full of information back to this committee. It's been really helpful. And I want to especially thank the CLA's office, and particularly, of course, Sharon So and Karen Kalfayan under the great leadership of Jerry Miller, because over the course of the last few days, they have taken all of that information, all of the discussions that we've had over the course of 6 days, all of the various requests that council members on this committee have made, the suggestions, the questions, the reports, and they've done their best to condense all of that into this report with their recommendations to reflect the sentiment of this committee for proposed changes to the mayor's budget. And I think it's been a tremendous work product that has come out of that. What you'll see in this report is an increase in the budget stabilization fund over what the mayor had originally proposed. And you'll also see funding of a number of programs and positions that are exceptionally important to this city and to the members of this council. Among other things, the proposal include restoration of funding for the evidence-based senior programmings that are important to many of our members, increased funding for medical and food supplies and animal services to reduce the number of animal euthanizations that we have, increased funding for the city attorney's office to support the neighborhood prosecutor program and Measure D enforcement against medical marijuana facilities. This proposal includes over $3.5 million for essential safety equipment that our men and women of the fire department depend upon for their lives and for the safety of our citizens. This proposal includes funding to offset sequestration cuts to the Department of Aging so that we can continue to maintain social services, family caregiver services, staff program support, and importantly, we can continue to maintain our senior meals program at the same level that it was able to be provided last year, despite the many cuts from the federal government that we're facing. This proposal includes support of the Los Angeles Community Broadband Network that Mr. Blumenfield has so strongly led the way on in order to bring this city into the 21st century. It includes funding to support the annual Congress of Neighborhoods and the Neighborhood Council Budget Day. This proposal includes $1 million to restore graffiti abatement. That's important in every one of our districts, and over $2 million for citywide median maintenance, which Mr. Kretz and others of us have asserted so strongly. It will include funding for supplemental maintenance at park facilities, including bathroom cleaning at some of our most critical sites and other important maintenance. And it restores funding to continue Tuesday hours at Griffith Park Observatory. And it provides funding for Operation Healthy Streets in Venice, which Mr. Bonin has been such a strong advocate for because of the significant, very significant and kind of unique challenges and problems due to the homeless situation in Venice. These proposals include, and I very strongly support, funding for the remediation and reopening of Chatsworth Park South that Mr. Englander has been such a champion for. This is, as he's pointed out many times, this is the one park that we have in the city that has been closed down due to toxic contamination. And these proposals are going to remedy that and get that park reopened. And then we also have all of the helpful and important and creative suggestions on transportation funding that Mr. Bonin had recommended regarding moving money around from the various transportation funds in order to more closely focus on the immediate needs that we have for transportation right now. So with that, I'm going to go first. I think if we wait just a moment on the detailed report on the recommendations, I'd like to ask the public to come up and offer their comments first. And again, we'll be 1 minute per speaker. And I'd like you to come on up and be ready to speak as soon as the previous speaker is done. The first speaker will be Donald Wegman, followed by Dr. Molly Rhodes. Mr. Wegman?
Hello, I'm Donald Wegeman. I'm speaking on behalf of the restoration of the notion of 4 staff members in the planning department who would work closely with HPOZs. Los Angeles tourism is burgeoning, and it's partly on account of our buildings being rediscovered, including the beautiful building we're in now. And the protection of those buildings is, a very great concern of the 25,000 structures within HPOZs in the city, which probably contain a couple of 100,000 people. So I'm in accord with the LA Times editorial today promoting those 4 positions for planning department.
Thank you very much, sir. Our next speaker is Dr. Molly Rhodes, who will be followed by Sheila Moore. Dr. Rhodes.
Hello, I'll be quick. I see in the CLA report that there's a recommendation to have a committee to review contracting and tree services, and we're very pleased to see that. I had left a memo with the clerk for you reviewing 4 contracts as a sample of the kind of waste that we're seeing because we've lost core services in tree trimming. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Sheila Moore, followed by Stephen Voss.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Sheila Moore. I'm the Director of Senior Center Services at Jewish Family Service of Los Angeles. JFS is celebrating 160 years this year as a provider of a wide range of social services to low-income individuals. And today I'm here to express our deep gratitude to the Budget Committee and to the City Council for recognizing that services for low-income seniors are a critical priority and need to ensure that these services remain available citywide. And particularly, we're most appreciative of your support for the funding that preserves the evidence-based programs at the multipurpose senior centers in Council Districts 5, 11, and 14, ensuring equity for the seniors in Los Angeles. So we look forward to working in partnership with the city to provide resources to improve the quality of life of all our community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Stephen Voss, followed by Susan Rubin.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to be heard. My name is Stephen Voss. I'm president of International Institute of Los Angeles. We're celebrating our centennial this year, and we provide a wide range of social services. And I, like the previous speaker, am here mainly to say thank you very much for your efforts to restore funding that will enable services in several districts to go forward or to be reinstated for evidence-based programs for seniors. It is a proven fact through research that the investment that is made in programs like these help large numbers of people avoid avoidable institutionalization, helps them function independently in the community, and we think it's just simply the very right thing to do. So again, on behalf of the constituents in Council District 14, I thank you all very much.
Thank you, sir. Our next speaker is Susan Rubin, followed by Adrian Scott Fine.
Good afternoon. I'm Susan Rubin, Vice President of Homeby Westwood Property Owners Association, and we're in the process of doing an HPOZ. And I'm asking you today to please provide the funding for 4 people in the Planning Department to handle HPOZs. Our area is the most historic intact area of the West Side. But we are losing our identity house by house with negatively impactful design-as-you-go construction without any architectural integrity, and residents are very frustrated. Architecture is just as important to our sense of well-being as music or art. Today's LA Times editorial, which says, "Saving LA's history, the city should act to clear up a backlog of application by areas seeking historic status." The last paragraph reads, "But for now, the council needs to fund these positions or run the risk that some of these aspiring historic districts won't have enough historic properties left to qualify." What makes LA special is our neighborhoods. Please provide the funding to preserve them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And just by way of brief response, for those who haven't had a chance yet to read the CLA's report, it does include a recommendation to add position authority and 9 months funding for 4 planning associate positions to support the neighborhood conservation program, $325,000. Our next speaker is Adrian Scott Fine, followed by John Girodo.
Good afternoon, council members. Adrian Scott Fine with the Los Angeles Conservancy, and I'm speaking on behalf of this issue of the 4 positions in city planning and neighborhood conservation on behalf of our members throughout the city. And we're very encouraged and very supportive and appreciative of the council members for restoring this funding. It is critical in terms of the HPOZ program being able to move forward and to address these issues of mansionizations, tear downs, and the loss of community character in so many of these great neighborhoods throughout the city. These are critically important tools. So again, we really appreciate and thank you, and thank especially Councilman Koretz for really helping us and advocating for these positions to be funded and to move forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is John Girodo, followed by Juan Vasquez.
Good day. I'm speaking today on behalf of the Board of Directors and membership of Hollywood Heritage. For 3 decades, Hollywood Heritage has advocated for the preservation and protection of Hollywood's historic resources, resulting in the rehabilitation of significant landmarks and historic districts. Hollywood Heritage once again voices our strong support for the Department of City Planning's funding request for 4 additional staff members, allowing the neighborhood conservation and HPOZ programs to continue forward. Historic preservation is proven to be a successful tool to promote both revitalization and economic development. I thank the City Council for acting now to protect the fabric of our neighborhoods.
Thank you, sir. Our next speaker is Juan Vasquez, followed by Michael Hunt.
Good afternoon, Chair and members of the Budget and Finance Committee. My name is Juan Vasquez, and I am a proud traffic officer for the City of Los Angeles. I am here today with several of my colleagues, traffic officers from the City of Los Angeles. I'm here with other traffic officers to fix LA. Traffic control services are down 74% since 2008. We need more full-time traffic officers to perform vital services that the City of Los Angeles depends on. Make Wall Street pay its fair share, get the millions they owe the city in uncollected taxes, invest in infrastructure, and restore services. Create good full-time jobs like full-time traffic officers and sergeants. We support Councilmember Bonning's motion not to fund additional part-time traffic officers. Use that money to fund additional full-time traffic officers and sergeants to effectively provide the services the City of Los Angeles depends on and deserves. In 1994, LA DOT traffic officers stood alongside LAPD and LAFD during the Northridge earthquake as first responders. We fixed LA then. We want to fix LA now. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your service. Our next speaker is Michael Hunt, followed by Jim Mcquisten.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Hunt. I'm a transportation engineer. I've worked for the city for 23 years. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an SEIU 721 union steward and bargaining team member. I'm here today to support my LA DOT family members, our traffic officers. At a time where the city is being accused of using illegal quotas for ticket writing, do we really want to bring in part-time traffic officers whose sole responsibility is to write tickets and who depend on writing tickets to keep their jobs? Our full-time traffic officers are fully trained, and they perform numerous duties. They impound vehicles, traffic control. There's no pressure to have quotas. The tickets, jobs, they don't hinge on writing those tickets. So let's do the right thing. Remove the 50 part-time traffic officers from the budget. If they're really needed, make them full-time positions. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Jim Mcquisten, followed by Doug Arsenault.
Jim Mcquisten. As you know, I do an outside analysis of the memos, detailed, and interestingly enough, I come out with the same number as the CLA. Congratulations. And we're restoring the same kinds of things. We differ on a few minor things, but let me remind everybody in the audience, this is a budget. This doesn't mean it's written in stone. We change this thing weekly, and we have plenty of backup for this new budget. It doesn't really matter a whole lot exactly which ones are which. I'd say we can go ahead and pass this change as the CLA has requested with no problem whatsoever.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Doug Arsenault, followed by Victor Gordo.
Thank you, council members. My name is Doug Arsenault of the Valley Industry and Commerce Association, representing more than 400 businesses in the city and surrounding areas. VICA is a founding member of the Axe to Tax Coalition, along with the Central City Association and the LA Area Chamber of Commerce. We strongly encourage the committee to send a more significant message to the business community by reducing the business tax over a faster timeline. In our meetings with you, we have seen a true commitment to enhancing the business friendliness of our over-regulating, overtaxing city. We know you cannot fix it all in a day, but real action on this issue will show a commitment to establishing a positive relationship with the business community. While the mayor's proposal amounting to a 30-year phase-out is a step in the right direction, it is insufficient to reverse 35 years of job loss. We fully endorse the Business Tax Advisory Council's recommended plan. Despite supreme institutional pressures and 2 faulty reports, BTAC persevered in crafting a viable plan that consolidates rates and uses a 15-year measured approach. The business community is open to a longer timeline than 15 years, but 30 years is far too long to provide a path towards stability. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next speaker, and as of this moment, our final speaker, unless we have additional cards, doesn't appear that we do, so this will be the final speaker, Victor Gordo.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chairman, members of the City Council, my name is Victor Gordo with LaUna Local 777. We're here in support of the traffic officers and the DOT traffic control program. And let's keep in mind that it is a program that that exists over at DOT. And so it's important that we hire people who are committed full-time and long-time in a career path. It's important that we restore services. As you know, traffic control and traffic in general is probably one of the most important issues in the city of Los Angeles. It affects both people in their residential neighborhoods as well as the business districts. And so we would ask that you move to restore services by hiring more full-time traffic officers, one, and two, ensuring that you have a core of supervisors to support that group. We're urging that you fill the 4 vacancies that currently exist and add additional 4 vacancies in the rank of sergeant. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. All right. Thank you to all the members of the public who were here to offer your comments both today and throughout our previous 6 days of consideration of the budget. I'd like to ask now the CLA's office to come forward to present their report. And as they do that, members, I want to apologize in advance that the committee is going to have to take a brief recess from 2:15 until about 3 o'clock. Unfortunately, 2 of our members need to meet with the mayor regarding the MTA, and that's the only time that it can be done. So we're going to have to take a brief recess, get a cup of coffee, and then come on back at 3 o'clock. Mr. Miller.
Good afternoon. I'll be very brief and give sort of a large overview, and then Karen will take you through what's called the rack-up. I first of all want to echo the chair's thanks to the various departments that have worked very hard throughout all of this. Certainly Mr. Cole and the mayor's budget staff. Of course, the CAO has been terrific. And truly, my budget staff, Sharon, Karen, Roy, lots of folks that are in this room, really worked tirelessly. You've got a very strong budget before you, as the chair indicated. The reserve fund is up slightly. There's a little bit more money going into the budget stabilization fund. So again, I think you've got a very strong budget in front of you. I will, of course, as I'm known to be a bit of a wet blanket. Because in the summary of the report, we do discuss needing to start thinking about an economic downturn, and that's really oriented towards the Budget Stabilization Fund. We've had 13 recessions since the Great Depression, and on average, they occur about every 5 years. So we, although it doesn't feel like it, we're 5 years now into the recovery from the Great Recession. And we're projecting deficits through fiscal year until 18-19. And at that point, we will be basically at the longest interval between recessions since 1933. So you have much fewer tools than you've had in the past. You can't really raise revenue without a vote of the people. There really is no substantial revenue source left that hasn't been used. The last one was the trash fee that was used to supplement general funds for the police. Again, I do want to stress that going forward, getting the budget in structural balance so that a recession will be easier to deal with is very important. And also having a robust budget stabilization fund is going to be important going forward so that we can avoid the really draconian cuts both to our employees and to the services of the public that we did experience just a few years ago. So with that, I will turn it over to Karen and Sharon to walk you through the details of the report.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members. What I'd like to do is just go through the report, and the easiest way to do this maybe would just be to go page by page, and I'll just summarize some of the items, highlight some of them, and if there's anything that you want to either flag for discussion later, or if there's something that can simply be answered right away, we'll just take care of that right on the spot. So just beginning on page 1, the budget overview. This is just, it summarizes the mayor's proposed budget, and really not a whole lot to do there. It's just a summary of the budget. And same with page 2. It also gives some additional instructions for. I'm sorry. It's page 2, just an overview. Page 3 is continuing the overview and then just focusing on what the Budget and Finance Committee had indicated that they the priorities for you, and I think you've already covered them. Maintaining current levels of service, modest increases in critical areas, addressing capital and infrastructure, and so on. So moving on to page 4. I'll go to the middle, around the middle of the page with the global recommendations. And these are things that we include each year, standard recommendations with regard to labor, focus on infrastructure. Page 5, we mentioned performance metrics. This is the committee had indicated its support to continue moving toward a performance-based budgeting system. So there's a section in here that addresses the metrics and the continuing effort to develop those metrics and bring them back in a continuing way to support the performance budgeting process. Also, continuing a modified hiring freeze. We didn't talk about this too much over the course of the committee hearings, but what we'd like to do is bring back a modified approach. We've had a freeze before, and we've had the managed hiring process. It's been a difficult thing for departments, and so what we want to do is bring back something where a baseline is established with the presentation of hiring plans, and then that way at the beginning of each year, and that can be done as soon as this budget is adopted. Departments can submit their hiring plans, they can be reviewed, and then they can hire to that hiring plan without having to come back to managed hiring. And so managed hiring would be more of an exception basis. But we'll bring a report back before the end of the fiscal year, and that'll be for the council to consider. Moving on to page 6. These cover just the routine reports that you get throughout the year with regard to fees, the financial status reports, and so on. And page 7 summarizes the financial policies and the compliance. We've already really covered that, so I'll just actually jump over to page 9. Page 9 covers the revenue. In the course of our review, we've identified some additional revenue, and this revenue is programmed into the changes that we're proposing on the following pages. Page 10, beginning with expenditure changes, and let me mention that not all items that are recommended here are in for each department or in one section. This is broken out into different sections. There's expenditures, there are changes that don't have any sort of a general fund impact, and then there are also technical adjustments. So departments are scattered throughout the report. So the first the first group on page 10. Aging, we've talked about the evidence-based programs, animal services, the medical and food supplies, and the vacant restoration of the vacant clerk typist position for shelter operations. The city attorney adding back 5 deputy city attorneys for the neighborhood prosecutor program and Measure D enforcement. City clerk, this includes support of the additional languages for elections. Also funding for the general benefit portion of business improvement districts, and then funding for the signature verification for the matching funds program. For economic and workforce development, there was a request to include some positions for the asset management and lending units, so that's included here. With ethics, for the contract database, support of the contract database, and for fire, the first item there is really a shift from one account to another, so there's no net change in their overall budget on that. And then adding staffing for Fire Stat LA. Moving to page 11, it's the fire safety equipment, adjustment for the fire police pension fund to reflect budgeted sworn salaries, and then under general city purposes, there's a reduction for the fee reimbursements on solid waste fee and reimbursements, increasing the amount for senior meals, and providing funding for the Sandra Cisneros Learning Academy, which is also provides senior programs. Under forfeited assets, this is just there's a allocation of some funds there for police expenses, and a correction to their schedule. And then further down under general city purposes and unappropriated balance, this was a proposal that the mayor had brought forward to decrease the amount for the supply management system and restore funding for the fee subsidies and community services. Under the housing and community investment on page 11, that's funding for the, actually that's Vera Davis. And on page 12, these are some various adjustments based on for human resources benefits for revised premium increases. Under ITA, the community broadband, funding for the community broadband, the maintenance of the public safety radio, microwave communication sites, which was identified by ITA as a priority. And it also provides funding for the Congress of Neighborhoods and for Neighborhood Council Budget Day, just a modest amount there. The next item, planning. This is the funding for the neighborhood conservation program that a number of the speakers had addressed. So that's the funding for the 4 positions. And then also the committee had indicated their desire to increase the amounts for graffiti abatement. There's $1 million included for that, and that would restore it to the current level. On street services, also restoring funding for the median maintenance program. That's also to bring it up to the current level, and funding for contract services for the Save Our Streets initiative. Under recreation and parks, the first item there, this is restoration of funding for the Class Park program at the HACLA sites, and that would be Jordan Downs, Imperial Courts, Ramona Gardens, and Nickerson. I just want to make one amendment. The second part of that sentence should just be deleted. There is no grid program savings that's identified to support that, so that can just be crossed out. And also some funding for the supplemental maintenance at parks facilities. This is extra restroom cleanings and so on. Griffith Park, restoring Tuesday hours at the Griffith Park Observatory, and some staffing that had been deleted. And the last one on page...
Actually, sorry, Ms. Calfine, a very small point, but I want to make sure that this language is clear, that the supplemental maintenance at park facilities applies broadly.
Yes,
this is not limited
citywide.
to the Class Park
no. These are
heading
two...
that it's under, actually. So that should probably be
Right.
a separate bullet point.
It should
just
have
to
its own little
make-
diamond,
yeah,
yes.
exactly.
Right.
Yeah, Mr. Kretz.
In general, are we intending to stop and talk about items at the end of this whole presentation, I'm presuming?
That would be my intention, yeah. But if there's a minor point like this that you can just clarify, that'd be fine too. If there are big issues that we're going to be discussing a lot, like LAPD overtime or firefighter hiring or ambulance augmentation, those sorts of big ticket items, we'll save those towards the end. But
Okay. I just have a general clarification question on the Human Resources Benefit Fund at the top of page 12. What is that savings? That's not clear.
Go ahead.
Councilman, it's due to a change in the anticipated rates for the subsidies for Kaiser. We received some information. This information will be communicated to the JLMBC on Thursday, I believe.
So we expect the rates to be lower, basically.
Yes, the proposed budget anticipated that the rates would increase by about 6%, and indeed the Kaiser rates are coming in at just under 1%.
Oh, very good. Thank you.
All right, moving on to page 13. This is to provide an allocation for the Operation Healthy Streets program in Venice. And then the last item there would increase the reserve for economic uncertainty in the unappropriated balance from $17.5 million to just nearly $27 million. And that will be used for, just as it says, economic uncertainties throughout the course of the fiscal year. Moving to page 14, under other changes, these are all changes where there's no net effect on the general fund. So generally speaking, these are either positions that are added which have no funding impact. They may be supported by special funds. It could be reappropriations of current year funds into the following fiscal year as for the controller for their accounting pool. The third one on that page, the general city purposes and cultural affairs, just wanted to note that this would be a reduction in the innovation fund, taking the cultural affairs funding and using it for cultural and community events, but it would leave $1 million in the innovation fund for the first year of its operation. And then the general city purposes and unappropriated balance. This was in the general city purposes, there's an item for the police and fire dispatch, and it seems to be more appropriate to have that in the unappropriated balance until the program regarding the dispatch could come back. So a recommendation there is to move that funding from GCP and into the unappropriated balance. The next two, housing and personnel, are also positions for which funding is from special funds. One's for personnel for building, supportive building and safety, and the other's an accounting clerk for the housing department. Under planning, there's some funding there for software licenses, which is also special funded, and also some positions for engineering in support of the development services reform. On page 15, again, continuing with some positions that are special funded for sanitation for the multifamily bulky item collection program. Also, there's a note here. The department had requested that their salary savings rate for the solid resources program be reduced, and so this reflects that reduction. On public works, street lighting, as you'll recall during the discussion, there was a request to move some of the funding in the street lighting maintenance and assessment fund from tree trimming and into the high voltage program. So rather than moving it from the tree trimming, there was an instruction to instead take a portion of the reserve within that special fund and move that toward the high voltage system. So that's what this recommendation does. It leaves the tree trimming amount intact. And just as a note, that fund does have a projected deficit, and that's something that's going to have to be addressed over the course of the next year or 2 years or so. There's also an amend their their fund schedule. Under Recreation and Parks, this is the funding for the Chatsworth Park remediation Chatsworth Park South remediation that was mentioned earlier. And then transportation, this is the reallocation of funds within special funds from Prop A and Measure R, and this also supports several positions, one of which was discussed, which is the senior transportation engineer. There's also some further resolution authorities for the Department of Transportation and in support of Metro Expo and the parking permit sub-program. On page 16, the traffic officer program, also this was addressed by several of the speakers. Our recommendations here are to reduce the number of part-time traffic officers from the 200 that's proposed in the budget back to the 150 that's there currently.
I appreciate that, but please let Ms. Kalfine go ahead and finish.
And then take whatever savings might occur from those and use them for full-time traffic officers. That would, if those positions are filled partway through the year, we think there might be enough for 4 or 5 positions, so we're recommending 5. But there's also further in the report, there's the list of reports, and there's also one that addresses this program and addressing gridlock intersections, I think, which is one of the concerns that the committee had raised.
One moment, please, Mr. Kretz.
Yeah, I'm happy to see us stop hiring new part-time traffic officers, but I'm confused by the numbers. It looks like we lose about $3 million in citations by not hiring the 50 officers, and then we gain back almost that much by hiring 17 part-time traffic officers. Now, should the word full-time be by the 17, or is there something I'm missing on the math?
No, the 17 are part-time. Right now, the department has authority for 150 part-time traffic officers. As we understand it, only 133 of those 150 are filled. So if they were to fill all of the existing vacancies in the part-time program, they could make up, and using the number of positions, the number of hours that they work, and the average number of tickets, they can make up the revenue, that $3 million, or roughly $3 million, a little under that. Then there would be
the math looks like it doesn't work, because it looks like you lose $3 million by not hiring 50, then you gain $2.3 million by hiring 17. Unless I'm misreading it, it doesn't match up.
by hiring the 17, what that says is they essentially can meet the same revenue, the revenue goal because you lose the revenue that was anticipated for the 50. If you fill to the maximum, the 150, they could still make that revenue projection, is what we've understood. So what there are savings is that you have the savings from not hiring the additional 50, and that can be applied to full-time officers.
But I think the question is on a per officer basis. If you figure that you lose $3 million in revenues from 50, then you shouldn't be gaining $2.3 million by hiring 17 unless they're significantly increasing their hours.
In fact, it looks like it would be a more appropriate trade-off if you didn't hire 50 part-time and you replaced them with 17 full-time. Mm-hmm. That math might be better. It sounds like you'd be able to do it, and you would then generate the kind of money you're talking about.
Councilman, I think that what was in the proposed budget for the $3 million, and Department of Transportation might be able to answer this more clearly, but I believe that the $3 million was actually based on a partial year, that the 50 officers that would be hired, the new 50 part-timers that were proposed in the budget, would not be full year, whereas the 17 that are being proposed to be filled now are already currently authorized. So that's the difference.
Okay, because that's not shown. And I'm completely in agreement with eliminating more part-time officers, but I do want to make clear, Mr. Bonin and I might have a slight philosophical disagreement. I don't think that implies that new full-time officers can't write tickets, because in fact, I don't view it as punitive. They're writing tickets for a reason. I happen to live in a neighborhood where we are swamped with illegal parkers. And we get relief on the weekends, and we say, thank God the part-time officers are here for 2 days, so we get 2 days where we get some help in being able to park in our permit parking district. But during the week, we're swamped because we don't have full-time officers that can do that. So they only help on the weekends. I'm assuming that if we replace them with full-time officers, we continue to get some relief in terms of parking enforcement, and that's a helpful rather than punitive thing. So we also give them flexibility, so when they're needed to perform other functions, they can do it. I also think hiring part-time officers is really kind of a scam, because we're just finding a way around all the protections we give our full-time employees to save a little money. But the fact is, long-term, once we're in recovery, we shouldn't be pulling off this scam, and we should just say, all right, if we need X number of people, let's hire them, and let's hire them full-time. We know we need them. We know we're actually underserved in terms of the number of people we need for all these functions. And we know they're revenue producing. So let's just hire these folks full-time.
Okay. Mr. Bonin, did you want to speak to this?
Yeah, just very quickly. I don't know that Mr. Kretz and I have an extreme philosophical difference on this. I think one of the things that's important to point out is that a part-time officer is not trained or authorized or deployed for traffic control. They're pretty much exclusively issuing tickets. And while I understand there is some value to that, I think sometimes we do that overkill, and we have done it at the expense of getting people through gridlocked intersections. So to me, the value of doing the full-time is we actually get a balance.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Let's go find
The next couple of items on page 16 were also made at the request of the mayor's office, and this was to move a couple of items that were in the unappropriated balance into the appropriate departmental accounts. So one moves funding for the firefighter hiring into personnel, and the second moves the evidence property information management system funding to the police department. The bottom line on the recommendations, it would be, in addition to increasing the reserve for economic uncertainty, it would include a couple of $1 million to put in the budget stabilization fund and a slight increase to the reserve fund. The next few pages are instructions and technical adjustments. The first section is Exhibit H. It's really mostly cleanup. Exhibit H in the budget is meant to be instructions to effectuate the actions in the budget, but a number of reports are included in there. So this really is cleaning it up, taking the reports out of Exhibit H, putting them into the attachment to the report so that those reports would come back to the appropriate committees and then to the full council. There are a couple I'd like to highlight. First of all, on the top of page 18, the two there involving the controller for some reason didn't end up in the list of reports. So we would just make that amendment to include those into the attachment. And then some of these are on their own separate track, and so we've deleted the ones that have a separate council file and are moving along on a different, in a different way. And then let's see, on page 19, these are all, again, these are all added to the reports on the attachment. And then on page 20, these are the ones I wanted to highlight. There's an amendment to one of them regarding the Innovation Fund, and that is to allow that to go through the Innovation, Technology, and General Services Committee. And then there's one adding the issue that Mr. Englander had raised regarding new car dealerships and ensuring the inclusion of auto leases, so that's added. Also, there's an instruction added for the CAO and our office to report with a policy using a portion of the funds from the sale of former CRA property for affordable housing and economic development. Using former CRA funds has been raised through the Housing Committee and also the Economic Development Committee as a means of funding affordable housing and funding economic development. So this essentially would be our office is bringing back a policy for the committee to consider on that. And then the next one is with regard to the transient occupancy tax and applying that to Airbnb, which was raised by Mr. Bonin. And the last one is an instruction for a memorandum of agreement governing the use of the case processing fund for billing purposes, and that was an issue raised by the planning department. The rest on that page, on page 20, are routine instructions regarding depositing of funds, reimbursing using grant receipts for reimbursement, and so on. And then beginning on middle of page 21 are technical adjustments. And these generally are, they also don't have a fiscal impact. In some cases, they're taking resolution authority and adding regular authority for positions, and then there's also a section on capital improvement funds. And there was much discussion about the capital program and improving our capital infrastructure. So there are a couple of different instructions here. One would be to modify the CIEP to add some projects. Two of them were added at the request of the council president to decrease the Rancho Cienega Recreation Center amount by $2.5 million and include funding for South Park and the Pacoima Arts Incubator. And it also would add to the MICLA program for 2014-15 the City Hall cooling system that was discussed, the West Valley Municipal Building, and then it would also designate a portion of the citywide nuisance abatement funds for Old Fire Station 62 in Mar Vista. And then there's also an instruction to authorize use of the citywide maintenance and maintenance improvements for projects including the Oakdale Storm Drain, Eagle Rock City Hall, and the Chicago Building. And then the last one on that page is would allow the CAO to reappropriate some funds for an intern program. On page 22, the For the city clerk, this is restoring positions that would have transferred to the Economic and Workforce Development Department. But since the bid program is staying in the city clerk, this restores their positions, the chief management analyst, the accounting clerk 2, and a management analyst 2. For the convention center, consistent with Plan B that's included in one of the council files, this would add a list of projects to receive MCLF debt financing. And then for disability, this restores position authority for the city's AIDS coordinator, and that's funded through the Community Development Block Grant. So this is only to restore the position. Under fire, adds a programmer analyst to support network staffing the system. And we also have a note here. The committee had expressed its desire to augment fire resources. So in order to partially address the staffing issues, we recommend that the committee instruct the CAO and the fire department to report on steps necessary to institute a recall to active duty program. And that's one thing that could alleviate some of the staffing issues within the fire department. Under ethics, we add authority for 2 auditors, regular authority for 2 auditors, allows finance to reappropriate unspent money for the treasury management system, and then a correction on the GCP item, that's to reappropriate $52,000 in 2013-14 for some of the memberships for the independent cities, California cities, and so on. General services would add a heavy-duty mechanics who service our heavy-duty trucks and equipment. On page 23, the library and police item is just to restore or allow the position authority for the security positions at the library. The funding is already included in the budget. And it would allow them to amend their current memorandum of agreement for those services. For neighborhood empowerment, it would add resolution authority for positions in support of their grievance and complaint process system. Under planning, it includes a planner for the Venice local coastal program and reappropriates unspent money for the citywide sign unit. For the board, this is just a correction to a name of a fund or program. So that's just a technical change. Contract administration adds back positions for the airport projects and for engineering for the LA River projects. Recreation and parks, they had indicated there was a number of positions that were deleted from their budget, and they had highlighted the positions that were the highest priority. 13 gardener caretakers and some recreation coordinators. These are added back, and there's some corrections to their schedules too. On page 24, again, some adjustments to schedules. Adding, Mr. Englander had mentioned that one of the line items in the UB be expanded to include the hiring of detention officers. The zoo has a schedule amendment, and then we have some miscellaneous footnotes that needed to be added. The remainder of the report, and I will not go through all these, are the 200 plus reports that were requested by the committee members. So unless there are any questions about those, I won't go through those in any detail. And I think that gets you to your 2:15 mark.
Terrific. Thank you. And it appears that our meeting is delayed by 5 minutes, so that gives us time for 5 minutes worth of comments and questions before we go. Mr. Englander, did you have some things that you wanted to cover?
I did, and I have a couple technical corrections, but perhaps those will be done after the break. So if I could just use this opportunity for a minute of comment, and really particularly want to thank our CLA and CAO and the team, Sharon and Karen, and for doing just such a phenomenal job, and particularly the budget chair, Mr. Kokorian, as well. To me, the city budget is a lot more than numbers on a page, and it's not just about balancing. It's about priorities and funding what's critically important, the cornerstone and the functions of local government, starting with public safety and some of the efforts we're making towards fire stat, restoring some of the critical components of the fire department, including their equipment, tanks, things that
they need to keep in operation or vital infrastructure, and at least making some movement towards repairing some of the sidewalks and maintaining streets, things that are critically important, community beautification programs, making sure that we're maintaining, restoring the funds in the graffiti abatement, which we all think is so important. It is that important, and making sure we protect the medians and we protect all of our communities. A lot of the things we've done in technology that are being proposed, in ensuring that customer service levels are maintained, and that's really what technology is all about, is making sure that people have access to the information, to service requests, to ensure they're getting the service they request. So without going through all of these, and looking at the things we've spent most of our time discussing during the budget deliberations have really been about service qualities, making sure we're restoring those important functions to the customers, our customers, the residents and the businesses of Los Angeles. So I wanted to just take the minute without going through my technical changes and reserve those for later, and thank the committee chair and his staff and my staff and all of our staffs for the tremendous work and the dedication that they've done, particularly Nicole Burnson on my staff, who works tirelessly around the clock on this. I call her out by name. And thank you all.
Thank you very much. Well said. And I think it's worth noting that the CLA report that's before us bears a timestamp that says 1:29 a.m. So that's a pretty good indicator of the work that our CLA staff and all of our personal staff as well have put into this. And so far, it's a very good work product. So we thank you all very much. Just a couple more minutes, Mr. Kretz.
Well, I will just say that was so well said by Mr. Englander that I won't add much to it, although I will also thank the Mayor's Office for a very collaborative process and a very good initial budget, which with the CLA's work and everyone else, I think actually has turned out pretty well. Remarkably well considering where we started. Couple small things I wanted to ask about the 4 planning positions for historic conservation districts and the 5 positions in the city attorney's office were both funded only for 9 months. Why the 9 months? What's that? What does that mean?
Typically, if it's a new position, it takes some time to hire a person into that spot. So and it's not just for those 2. Anything that's a new position would be funded for 9 months to reflect the time it might take to hire.
So that's just an accuracy figure. It's not funding it for 9 months and hoping we find the last 3 at the end of the process.
No, it assumes that you wouldn't be able to fill the position until maybe sometime in the beginning of the second quarter.
And I know with our firefighter hiring, it was suggested that we beef that up, and I believe we didn't because we only thought that we'd be able to get 2 classes through the process.
Mr. Kretz, I'm going to defer discussion of firefighter hiring until after our recess because we're going to talk about that quite a bit. Firefighter hiring, the LAPD hiring, ambulance augmentation, and police overtime to the extent that people want to talk about that. Those are the things we'll come back and talk to you about after the break, if you don't mind.
How about one more easy one? On page 17, the second deletion relating to investment services, where does this item go to? What happens to it as a deleted item?
The ones that are deleted, there's an accompanying report in the attachment, and actually it should be attachment A, not attachment 1. That particular one is report number 53.
Okay, so it's just referred to as a different report.
Right.
Okay, and with the suggestions of business license tax, what's the appropriate way for us to deal with the suggestion of adding, rather than 3 years in the future, 4 or 5 years in the future?
Well, that's a policy
future
issue.
direction, but it was part of this budget.
Yeah, that's a policy issue that this committee could take up, and if desired, make that instruction or ask the appropriate departments to report on that as well.
Maybe we can discuss that when we reconvene. And those are all my simple ones.
With that, Mr. Bonin, you look like you have some questions, but I'm afraid we need to step out for a moment. So again, my apologies to all the folks who are here. There's no way that we could avoid this meeting that we have to have with the mayor right now. So we will, not that we want to avoid a meeting with the mayor. I should have put it a different way. There is no way that we could have scheduled it at any other time, is what I meant to say. So we'll take a brief recess and we will reconvene here at 3 p.m. on the dot. Thank you. Very much for your patience. The Budget and Finance Committee is now back in session, and we are ready to resume consideration of the CLA's recommendations regarding the 2014-2015 budget. Mr. Kretz, did you had gone through your comments already, or did you have additional comments or questions you had other than the sort of the big ticket items that I mentioned, which we can come back to?
I had remaining some at least reasonably big ticket items.
Okay.
But none of them are huge, so
okay. You
want to give me?
Yeah, go right ahead.
With the fire hiring, there's a suggestion that we try to do an additional tower or two because we are so understaffed. It sounds like part of the question is whether we physically could manage to make that happen. So I wonder if we could find some way to put the funding for at least one more tower into the UB and then at least have it funded if indeed we were able to do it.
And just to, if I can add a little bit to that, I think the discussion was that there were cost efficiency issues relating to whether they were going to be separate drill towers or increasing the number of classes and possibly even the size of the classes with regard to a particular drill tower. And then in the hiring process has sort of been disrupted right now. Can you speak to the timing of being able to initiate the drill towers and whether there are cost savings that can be realized in that way?
Yeah. Do you want to go ahead?
With regard to the drill tower, there are currently 2 classes that are proposed right now to start in February and June. If there is quick work done on the selection process and the hiring process and the certification process, there is the possibility that you could gain another class at the existing Valley training facility. To do that, you could start a class in October. The class size could be anywhere in the range of 60 to 70 recruits. The cost of doing that would be in the neighborhood of about $3 million. If you were to open a separate facility, then that would require actually bringing more people out of the field to actually form the training cadre. And there's a lot more extra costs associated with opening another facility. So if you could do the 3rd class at the existing facility, then it would cost in the neighborhood of the $3 million. If you were to open a completely new facility, perhaps at Terminal Island, as what was discussed, the cost would be significantly more.
Well, if there's some way to consider us doing the $3 million option, I think it would be a step in the right direction and the most cost-effective way to do it. If there's support for that on this body, I'd make that motion.
Okay.
I didn't understand the motion.
Was it?
The motion, well, the staff could probably restate the motion better than I, but the motion is to fund a 3rd class.
at a cost of about $3 million.
Because the other...
Yes, Mr. Blumenfield.
I mean, I think we all were very much in agreement. We want to have more classes. We want to have more boots on the ground. To do 2 classes, but we talked about this a little bit as well, would be, like $8 million additional that potentially we could put in the UB. And if, as the CLA is saying that they're not able to get to it, then nothing lost. But at least then, if they are able to get to it, we've created the incentive for them to get these classes done. So I might amend that to say, let's do up to 4 classes, put the $8 million in the UB, but do it in a way that if the CLA's, the CLA has legitimate concerns that they may not be able to get there, as I understand it. But if we at least put it out there in the UB, if they get there, we get the people, we create that incentive.
Councilman, there are actually limitations to doing 4 classes at that one Valley facility. They can only run a maximum of about 3 classes a year because it takes 20 weeks to go through the academy, and it just doesn't, it overlaps. And so the maximum they can run is probably 3 classes a year. Now, in terms of the action that this committee could take is to actually make the instruction to give the fire department the ability, the authority, the instruction to move forward and hire that 3rd class. To the extent possible, we can set the money aside in the reserve and say that there's money set aside in the reserve for that 3rd class. And you can get those...
In the reserve for
Yes.
economic uncertainty.
Correct.
Okay.
And just give that instruction to expedite all the processes that need to be done in order to actually certify that 3rd class. And so we can set the monies aside. There's the Reserve for Economic Uncertainties, which is about in the neighborhood of $27 million.
With our recommendations.
And we can basically carve out that $3 million of that is set aside for an additional class.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Bond.
Just another wrinkle on that, because there was another suggestion that I had made during the early part of our deliberations that I didn't think got a sufficient answer from LAPD, which was go back to what they did in the 80s with 24-hour platoon duty tower. You could do those classes because of the different hours in 16 weeks, not 20. You could graduate significantly more firefighters. You could utilize a single drill tower facility to maximize the use of existing training personnel, fire apparatus, equipment, such and such. A platoon could be held Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. B could be Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, some variation like that. And you could conceivably, would need to see some numbers on it, but conceivably you could provide, using this schedule like they did back in the 80s, up to 6 recruit classes, or 4 classes if you started as late as March. So I think there's certainly potential to do the 3 or the 4 in a couple different ways.
Okay. Mr. Englander.
Along this discussion, I think this is a discussion we have to have in detail and make some informed decisions, get some feedback from our CLA, our CAO, and working with the fire department on what is really feasible. It also means we've got a lot of firefighters because of the shortage and the shortage of staffing that we would take out of the field. So I'm all for it. I think what we've got to do is get into the details of what it means, not just a matter of budgeting it, and in the same breath have to have the conversation on the ambulance augmentation. So we've only got 2 months of funding for that currently as proposed in this budget. I would move that we have at least 6 months funding, so it would be adding 4 additional funds with the CLA coming back to identify what would the appropriate mechanism or funding source be for that. But I would move and put forth the motion that first and foremost we have that set, particularly in light of the time frame that Mr. Bonin had brought up last time when we adjourned, which was we're going to be coming back right off the recess and dealing with this issue. And so I think first and foremost is making sure we're covered in the field and in our communities. That's number one. And so I would start and prioritize this with ensuring we've got the ambulance augmentation plan funded for a period of 6 months. So it would be adding 4 more months. Then I would move that we have an immediate report coming back and doing a deep dive into what are these options, how much would it really cost, can the department sustain it, and bringing folks out of the field for training. It's not just a matter of having 4 classes or 6 classes. For every class, there's so many folks that have to come in and train as well, and you're taking people out. So what is reasonable and sustainable to ensure we can move as quickly as possible? But the other part of that is it should come back with detailed instruction, and it's already part of Exhibit H from RAND, and what they're doing to fix the hiring problems. How quickly can those things be resolved? And so I don't want to put the cart before the horse. I think we've got to prioritize the things we're talking about. So I would first propose that we deal with ensuring we've got enough ambulance and paramedics covering the city. And that'll give us that 6-month sort of breathing time to work in a crisis mode and time frame to figure out what we're doing and putting the standards of cover plan together, having that plan come back to the full council, to this committee for discussion and exactly how it is and what it is the RFP will look like, trying to get our arms around how we're going to deal with those issues as well. So there are a lot of pieces here, and I think if we could dissect them and prioritize them, because we don't have an unlimited budget, and all those issues need to be answered quickly. So that's what I would suggest we look at.
Well, and I will second the motion regarding 6 months, ensuring 6 months funding, which would be an additional 4 months beyond what's currently in the budget for the ambulance augmentation. And if you didn't mention, I would propose that funding actually be taken from the Reserve for Economic Uncertainties and funded for that 6 months of the program, consistent with the chief's request in actually the memos. I do want to just make clear again, as I do every time we talk about this, that it is not the council's action to instruct a specific ambulance deployment plan. That was the chief's decision, the previous chief's decision to do this. And we still don't know. We don't have the benefit of the standards of cover report. We don't know yet whether or not that's the appropriate deployment plan, but it's not our decision to make. Our decision to make is to provide the funding for the deployment plan that's there. If that proves to be inadequate funding, the chief also has the option of using that funding over the course of 12 months and changing the deployment plan. So that 6 months is not some deadline for this council to act. It's a deadline for the chief to act in determining what the most appropriate deployment plan is with the resources that we're affording under this budget. So I would second that. Sorry, Mr. Kretz, I'm trying to keep a few balls in the air here at once. So that would be my suggestion with ambulance augmentation, but let's just hold that for the moment because we are still in the discussion on hiring. Mr. Kretz.
Well, I'd suggest, based on all the suggestions, that we do the 4 months ambulance hiring, we do the $3 million for one additional class, and then we wait for a report back on whether more augmentation to that is recommended. But it's hard for me to see that no matter what comes back, that we wouldn't think that 2 classes was inadequate for such a strapped department, and that if we could do it, we wouldn't want a third.
I would second that proposal as well, and I think it's not necessarily our job right now to determine whether a 24-hour tower is better or not. It might be, but to the extent that that's relevant to our costing out the desired goal that we all have, which is to maximize hiring, it's relevant. But I don't think at this point we have in front of us enough information regarding increased attrition rates, for example, with a 24-hour tower and those sorts of things. But again, that's up to the department to determine with our instruction that it's the intention of this committee to maximize hiring and to provide sufficient funding for at least an additional drill tower class. fair to say?
Perfect. Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Is there any objection to proceeding that way with the ambulance and hiring? Mr. Engel, do you have another comment?
Just a couple things on the fire outside of that.
Well, let's resolve this, because I think we may be done with this. Mr. Blumenfield, any comments on those two proposals? So were we clear on those proposals?
To summarize, excuse me, it would set aside funds within the Reserve for Economic Uncertainty for 4 additional months for the ambulance augmentation plan. I think that would run about $3.5 million, and then 1 additional firefighter class, which would be about $3 million.
Yes. Now, can we separately designate that within the Reserve for Economic Uncertainty, or do we need to move it out and either put it separately in the UB or into the departmental budget? I'm fine with any of those options, provided that it's clear that that total funding is devoted to the fire department for those two purposes.
Yeah, I would suggest to leave it in the unappropriated balance. It could be done either way. Either earmark the money within the Reserve for Economic Uncertainty, or you could carve it out as a separate item within the UB. That's an option.
I would prefer to carve it out as a separate item in the UB if there's no objection to that, members. I just want to make crystal clear that this committee is committed to providing that additional funding to the fire department for those two very important purposes. Any objections to proceeding that way, members? All right, then that'll be the action of the committee on those two items. Now, Mr. Chris, do you have more on fire?
I do not.
Why don't we stick with fire for a moment and go back to Mr. Englander, and we'll finish that up, and then we can hop around that way.
Okay. On page 10, under the last item on the page, the funding for fire stat, battalion chief, senior clerk typist. The amount originally, and for whatever reason, it came out $16,235 short. It should be a total of $244,000 instead of $228,000. Unless I missed something or there's some other reason that. So, if you can let me know under separate cover, maybe there's something there that I wasn't aware of. Okay.
$16,000 in a multi-$100 million budget.
It was just, these are the issues we run into later, that then they come back and say we can't execute the contract because it was, so
yeah,
just minor.
It would probably more likely come out of the salary cost.
Yeah, okay.
So perhaps, the staffing of it may be delayed 1 week or so.
Yeah. The ambulance augmentation already went through. On page 11, on the fire safety equipment, I would add under the budget instruction that we asked the mayor's office, we said to establish the safety equipment as a priority in the application, to actually report back within 60 days to the Public Safety Committee on the status. On page 20...
Sorry, just so that we're clear, Mr. Englander. So on the status of the UAS...
On the UASI grants.
Applications.
Yes.
Okay. Obviously, any results of that should come back to this committee, too. In the regular replacement cycle, I think 60 days is enough time for them to report back to this committee and to public safety as well on the regular replacement cycle as well, so we can anticipate funding needs for the future on that as well.
Great. And then on page 22, under fire, it says the committee expressed its desire to augment fire resources. One area involved increasing the number of firefighter classes. The proposed budget includes funding for 2 classes. In order to partially address staffing issues, the committee should instruct the city administrative officer, the fire department, to report on the steps necessary to immediately institute a recall of duty. It says that the committee should instruct. Can we just go ahead and make that instruction and perhaps do it as part of Exhibit H, if that's appropriate?
Yes, that can be done.
Because I think this was just your recommendation back to us, so we'll go ahead and make the recommendation that it be an Exhibit H, because I think it was a good recommendation. That's all I had on fire.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Blumenfield.
I have a few other small items in other departments, but
Sure.
done with fire.
Anything else with fire? Mr. Blumenfield? Okay, go ahead, Mr. Blumenfield.
Okay. A couple of small items to knock out, I guess. Sanitation, in recommendation 179, this is the one we talked about. What's it? Attachment 1? Attachment 1. We talked about this and it raised the issue that we were potentially spending a lot of money to save. We're spending $400 a person to basically spend $200 a person, which didn't make any sense. And so we made a recommendation to go back to the Bureau of Sanitation to get this report about the Lifeline program. Since met with Sanitation, talked about it, and we've come up with a way that we can increase the Lifeline program and actually decrease funding in the unappropriated balance for Lifeline recertification by $400,000 and increase funding in the general city purposes by just $75,000. And in doing so, we avoid the whole issue of recertification. We basically expand the list from 51,200 now, which it is, to 52,000, allowing for the additional 600 people to be able to come into the program. And it seems like a net win-win, and I've gone through it with Sanitation. So rather than just wait for a report back, I think we should take the action of lowering the unappropriated balance by that amount and increasing the Lifeline program by $75,000.
Okay. Does any comments on that?
Just let me make sure I understand.
Right. And Sanitation can come up because I've also gone through.
Yeah, why don't we go ahead and have Representative Sanitation come up.
Good afternoon, Lisa Mowry, Sanitation. So the proposal, as the council member mentioned, we think would allow the greatest benefit to the city rather than spending $400,000 in next year's budget and an equivalent amount in the following year budget to go through and recertify all 51,000 customers on the Lifeline and maybe only find 1,000 people that can be moved off. It seems to be a better use of funds to instead go ahead and make a small increase to the cap amount from the $51,400 to $52,000. With that increase, which would cost $75,000, we'd be able to take everybody who's on the waiting list now, add them, as well as we expect we'd be able to cover most, if not all, of the people who might otherwise be put on a waiting list in fiscal year 14-15.
Members, I think that sounds like it makes good sense.
And then just for the specifics, right now there's $400,000 in the UB that would be reduced. Of that, $75,000 would be moved to the GCP with the rest of the Lifeline funding.
Okay, so there would be a net savings of $325.
Right.
Okay. I think that makes good sense, with the understanding that from time to time some recertification process needs to be, it perhaps doesn't need to be done every budget year. But at some point in the future, in order to avoid the accumulation of people who are still receiving benefits that aren't eligible, some recertification in the future will probably still be necessary on a periodic basis. But I think it's a very good observation that on an annual basis, if the return on investment is not there, it doesn't make sense.
And the report would still stand to do a report back to figure out the best way to do it. But we talked about maybe there's a 5-year way. There's plenty of ways. I don't want to presuppose the best way. Let them figure that out through the committee process, and at least this way we cover everybody, all of the vulnerable folks, but we don't waste a lot of money.
Great. So that's Mr. Blumenfield's motion. I'll second it. Is there any further question or objections? Seeing no objections. Great. Thank you. That'll be the action of the committee.
A couple other small items.
Go right ahead. Well, wait. Anything else on sanitation? Members? Okay, go ahead, Mr. Bloomfield.
On the Innovation Fund, Mayor's Innovation Fund, I just wanted to alter the language slightly. It was pointed out to me by the Mayor's office we may eventually want to change, we may want to change the methodology. We want to have the ability to do that. So just to add the words, unless and until an alternate methodology for award is approved by the ITGS committee.
What page are you referring to?
Page 20. The third bullet. It says amend the instruction regarding the Innovation Fund to include the proposed ordinance for the fund. This is where we took the fund that was, we thought it should go through as the usual city process, but it was pointed out that we may end up with certain amounts, like a smaller amount, that doesn't necessarily need to go through the entire city process every time. So we want to leave open that option to have a new methodology worked out by the committee and approved by the full council. So one way to do that would just be to say, to add on the language, unless and until an alternate methodology for award is approved by the ITGS committee. That allows us to do that. It was something that was requested by the Mayor's office, and I thought it made sense.
Makes sense. Any objection? Seeing none, that'll be the action of the committee. Why don't we go to Mr. Bond and see if do you have any comments, or not just on this, but I want to give everybody a chance to kind of weigh in on some things.
No, I know we're going to go back to LAFD stuff, but otherwise, I'm quite pleased.
Okay. Mr. Kretz, anything?
A couple more things. One that I mentioned earlier about business tax, whether it might be worth considering instruction to point out in our plans that we intend to do a fourth year at a 0.25% reduction, as we have proposed by the mayor for the previous 3 years.
Well,
not impacting this budget, but setting some policy and some direction for the business community to see as our intention.
Personally, I think that in that the most that has to do with our current budget is, anticipating revenue projections and its impact on our deficit over the course of the next few years. I'd prefer that we not look forward on policy decisions that far forward without having vetted it as a policy decision. It's not a budgetary impact issue at all on this budget. In fact, even the mayor's proposal, we send the signal in this budget in Exhibit H, but it doesn't have a revenue impact on this budget. So, and I think we have a report or an instruction for reports on that. I think it's among the 200 or so reports that we asked for. Am I right about that? Do we have? If we don't, so, yeah. I'm certain that we will be revisiting this in the budget committee at length. But
the only impact, although indirect, would be that by sending a stronger signal to the business community, in theory, you have the possibility that you recruit more business to the city and then wind up with more revenue as a result.
Okay. I think I would prefer, my own preference, I mean, members, you can weigh in on this, but my preference would be not to open that up at this point, but to deal with it separately within the budget committee's ordinary process and outside of the budget. Ms. Calfine, did you want to?
Yeah, just to comment on on that particular item. It's listed in Exhibit H to instruct the city attorney to bring back a draft ordinance. The ordinance regarding the business tax would come through the committee and through full council, so there would be an opportunity to discuss that and what framework you want to use for that.
Okay. Does that work?
If there isn't great enthusiasm to follow the direction that I've suggested, that'll work just fine. Okay.
Mr. Englander, on that point?
Just on that point, had the motion been to phase it out completely over the next 15 years, you would have had a second. But no, I think that the chair is actually, absolutely 100% correct. We've got a report coming back. This is a policy decision that we should weigh in as a full council. I'm there already on it, but it's something we've got to have outside of the budget discussion, sending a message and actually moving forward, whether it's a phase out, categorical changes, all of those things need to be and hopefully will be vetted very quickly with the mayor's office as well as the full city council. But I do believe that discussion, which should hopefully happen soon, it should be one that is a policy decision set by the entire council, not necessarily for this budget process.
Yeah, and just to put a little finer point on it from my perspective, there are a wide variety of different kind of business tax reforms that we can do and consider. The mayor's proposed a first step with this, but I've said many times that I think we have to ensure that the business tax reforms that we propose are targeted at job creation and revenue enhancement. And to determine that, thank you, to determine that, how best to target it is going to take a lengthy discussion, I think, among all of us. So that's where I'm at with that. Mr. Bonin, did you? Okay. All right, Mr. Kretz.
Fair enough. That's fine with me. And the only other issue I have is on the city attorney augmentation, because I think most or all of us thought that the 5 positions to deal with Prop D and 5 positions for neighborhood prosecutor were both needed, although obviously the Prop D isn't a permanent need, but having them split those needs or just delaying the neighborhood prosecutors for the time that it takes to get Prop D going doesn't seem ideal to me. I do want to make sure we do the full Prop D enforcement, and that could take a year or two before we've completely gone through that process and closed down all the places that need to be closed down. So I don't know if there's enthusiasm to restore more of that, but
Mr. Under?
Yeah, my enthusiasm is that every division should have a neighborhood prosecutor. We've been out without one in Devonshire for far too long. And, some council districts, other than some communities, since we have 21 divisions, have multiple neighborhood prosecutors that overlap. Some have fewer. And that's a core issue that we've got to deal with each and every day, with nuisance abatement issues, with all the things we've got to deal with in the community. It's a proven program, and I enthusiastically support the city attorney's efforts to bring that back and restore it. The fact that the issues on the other 5 positions, I think you're right. It would phase out over time as they caught up. So I guess the question might be, if we restore those 5 specifically for neighborhood prosecutor programs, they get those 5 positions, could there be an effort made working with the neighborhood councils, particularly as they're in the stations with the police department? A lot of these issues are police investigative work that has to be done, and having the neighborhood prosecutor in the station and putting that on their plate as well. So perhaps in a lot of the divisions that are even missing these, if their primary focus beginning with those issues, Prop D issues, consumes their workload for a period of time, they've got the backup support working in the division to get those reports done, working with the senior lead officers, working with the CPABs, working with the community, because a lot of that investigative work that has to be done is within the police department. And so I would actually move that those funds are specific to neighborhood prosecutors, and that at least helps address both issues and then creates a permanent structure in dealing with a lot of the other issues we've got as well.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Bonin.
I would oppose that. I don't think, and I'd be curious if CLA can make a recommendation on how we can do more than just the 5, because I think that the division of labor between neighborhood prosecutors and the Prop D enforcement doesn't quite match up that way. There are parts of the city that don't really have medical marijuana establishments, and there are parts of the city that have a huge concentration of them. And if you were to say that the neighborhood prosecutor for an area with a concentration of medical marijuana establishments needs to do both, one of those things is going to fall off. So if the city attorney feels they need to have dedicated resources for medical marijuana enforcement, then I want to see a way that we can do that, particularly if it's something temporary and those are going to fade away in a couple of years.
I should just point out and maybe ask Ms. Calfine to speak to the fact that keep in mind that there's already been enhancement of the neighborhood prosecutor program by the action that this committee and the council took in the third or fourth quarter of the current fiscal year with a mid-year augmentation of the city attorney's budget for those positions. This is another step forward, an important step. I don't know that it's necessary that the committee or even maybe appropriate for the committee to mandate the assignments that those positions are going to be given by our elected colleague, the city attorney. I think once we fund those positions, he would be free to deploy them in the way that he thinks is most effective. Would he not?
That would generally be the case. The committee could or council could request that he use them for a specific purpose. If they're designated as neighborhood prosecutors, then I think it would be a request that would be made of the city attorney.
Okay, Mr. Englander.
I would suggest that in looking at specifically, and I don't know if anybody else has feelings about this, but at least designating one at a minimum. Devonshire is geographically the largest division. We have huge areas. It's one division that's solely and completely contained within a council district as well. And that shortfall has really dramatically impacted some issues that we've been dealing with for a long time. So in getting at least that one back, understanding the needs of Prop D in other areas, but we don't have that as much. We had 85. We've closed down all of them. One or two pop up now and then. We're dealing with those. Been working very closely with the police department and city attorney's office. We spent 2 years in putting our own task force and enforcement team working with DEA and as well as the county in closing those down. So with that, we are short there. So I would ask if the committee would support me on that, as we desperately need at least one of however many we allocate in terms of the 5 or whatever else we do to augment the request, that at least one be designated to Devonshire for neighborhood prosecutor.
Yeah, and just so that I'm clear, Mr. Englander, I have the strong sense that it's the city attorney's strong commitment to have a neighborhood prosecutor in every police division. That has been his clear commitment, and so I expect that if we augment these positions, that is exactly what would happen. But here's another thought that maybe I can throw out, since Mr. Blumenfield was good enough to just save us $300,000 that we would have otherwise spent. It's now maybe available for us to spend. We've budgeted, the proposal is to provide 9 months funding for 5 deputy city attorney positions. Now those 5 positions would take us to the full 21 neighborhood prosecutors.
That's correct.
So if we were to fund those 5 and then an additional 2 positions, can we fund 2 positions with our savings and
Or 3. Yeah. It could probably be as many as 3.
All right. Then what do you think about giving the city attorney 3 more positions that could then be used for Prop D and other needs?
Yeah, agreed.
No objection?
I'd also like to request that LAPD on the weekend send Reserve Officer Englander to my district to help me with Prop D compliance.
Be careful what you wish for.
Noted.
All right. Sounds like that will be the action of the committee. Mr. Blumenfield, good work. Thank you. All right. I forget where we've left off. Mr. Kretz, anything
I think
further?
you have dealt with all my outstanding issues.
All right. Mr. Bonin, you haven't had a chance to weigh in too much on your remaining outstanding issues, if there are more.
The only remaining outstanding issue I have that I think is still a bit unresolved or that I'm unclear on is the issue that a number of us brought up about doing less contracting out of tree trimming and doing some hiring.
Proposal to deal with just that issue that maybe I can speak to.
You're solving all sorts of problems today, so I'll...
All right. You're on a roll, Mr. Bloomfield. Go for it.
Same issue about, we've all talked about the outstanding issue of contracting. So one thought would be, if we're comfortable to move maybe $2 million of the recommended $4 million to the UB until the report back is considered in the Personnel and Public Works Gang Reduction Committee, so that we have the $4 million going out for tree trimming. Let's at least hold $2 of that until we get that report back about the relative merits of the contracting. Because I'm also of the belief that, and I've stated this numerous times, that we need to have that in-house capacity as a check against the contractor folks. And we've asked for the report back, but we've also put all this money, not all this pittance, forward, but at least let's save half of that until the report is done so that we can potentially spend it on in-house services.
So there would be a designated carve-out in the UB for $2 million to be reserved for tree trimming, but how it gets spent is subject to further discussion.
In no way am I trying to lower the amount of tree trimming.
That's what
I'd love to increase the amount. But given the parameters that we're in, and given the fact that none of us are comfortable in just contracting them all out before we have the evidence in front of us, we have some stuff from SEIU that says some things, we have other things, and we're due for this report back. Let's hold that money or condition it, unless there's some downside to this, because I haven't thought all this through. If there is, I don't want to slow the tree trimming down at all.
Well, it has no budgetary impact. It's simply to hold $2 million for further discussion on how that program for tree trimming gets implemented. So is there any downside to doing so that you can think of?
The idea is to light a fire under this decision so that we can get to it and make an informed decision about the appropriate way to do tree trimming.
It seems like a good approach, unless there's some practical reason that we shouldn't do so. Does CLA have any thoughts on that?
Very open to practical reasons why we can't.
It seems clear.
Okay, members, any objection to proceeding like that?
Not at all.
Mr. England, are you good with that proposal? Hold? Okay, then we, without objection, that will be the action of the committee. Good recommendation.
Okay. Some other little items too.
We're going to stick with you, Mr. Blumenfield.
I don't have any other big saving items, though. Sorry. A question for the planning stuff. We had money previously for the environmental policy unit, 4 positions, and it was my understanding those positions could have been grant funded. So I wanted to look into the possibility of adding position authority pending grant funding or some other funding. Again, not a hit to our budget, but I forgot to ask when we met because it didn't come up, but it was an issue about that environmental planning unit.
Okay.
Is there any downside to doing that?
That could be done, and you could include the instruction to include those without funding, and that when the grant funds come in, that they be reimbursed. But you could also restrict them not to hire those positions until they know that the grant funds will be received.
Well, I want to be as loose as we can. I mean, I wanted to see those positions in, and they weren't included in the overall package. So I'm looking for some sort of a compromise, especially since they might be funded by grants and outside sources. So I'm looking for the most liberal solution that we can to this issue. And so I would say position authority pending grant approval.
Receipt of grant funds.
That's acceptable with the committee and the chair, and there should be no downside to that.
No budgetary impact by doing so, right? There would be resolution authority.
Correct.
If there's no objection, members, that seems sensible.
And somewhat similarly, but not quite exactly, because this is not grant related, on the ITA positions, they had requested 7 vacant positions, and so we're maybe wanted to look into the possibility of restoring the position authority without the funding. so that at least if they can get the savings, we can get some of those critical spots authorized.
And just a note on that, that can be done. There would be no general fund impact this year, but if those positions were continued, there would be an impact next year.
Right, but we would, if funding were to come in for that, we would make that decision at that time?
Well, if these are strictly general funded positions,
Right.
correct? Then that would come up in discussion next year, also the proposed budget.
Okay, well, I'm personally comfortable with that, but so I would propose that as a motion, but open it up to the committee.
So as regular positions as opposed to resolution authorities?
Resolution would be probably more appropriate.
Yeah, if they're resolution authorities, then it wouldn't necessarily have an impact on next year's budget.
Right.
So if that works for you, I think that's the better approach. Then we don't need to add to their base for next year.
Okay, but at least we have the authority for those positions.
Right. If there's no objection, no budgetary impact, so go ahead and approve that as well.
That's it for my small items. When we get to the police, I want to talk about those issues too, but that's a bigger issue.
Okay. Mr. Kretz, anything further for you? Mr. Englander? Nothing. Mr. Bonnet?
My only other item was I just wanted to get a little more clarity on the traffic control officers issue that was brought up from page 16, and I'm wondering if the Chief Savelli could come up to the table. He was there a minute ago. No.
Good afternoon. Brian Hill, Deputy Chief. Chief Savelli went upstairs to meet with Councilman O'Farrell. I can have him come down if you need to speak with him.
Maybe you can answer it. I just wanted to talk about the proposal the CLA had regarding the part-time versus full-time traffic officers. As you heard them say, is they wanted to give you the ability to fill the 17 half-time vacancies, and that would allow you to get to the $3 million in revenue, and then use the savings in order to hire five full-time officers who could be working on primarily on traffic control. And I just wanted to double verify that those assumptions are ones that you guys agree with and support.
Yes, we did discuss it within our administrative staff and looking at that particular configuration and felt that those numbers were accurate.
And will this level of staffing allow you to begin augmenting the amount of time that traffic control officers are spent dealing with gridlocked intersections?
We think it will expand our ability to address some of those service needs in a better way. Certainly, it's not enough to fully address the needs that exist currently.
What we're going to do in Transportation Committee is I'm looking to have a monthly report on deployment of traffic control officers so we can begin to develop some metrics for the department and measure success, whether or not deploying at intersections actually relieves gridlock, what intersections they're deployed at. So we'll look at a lot of that as a sort of a policy matter during the course of the year.
Yes, we would appreciate that.
You bet. Okay, I'm good.
Thank you. Mr. Kretz?
Not on the subjects.
That's all right.
Okay. Back on tree trimming, the one thing that sort of keeps eating at me looking at the document that SEIU 721 provided is that we're estimating a fair number for tree trimming contracts, and then the contracts have come in, as high as 129% above a fair amount. I wonder if there's some way to put a cap on the amounts of these bids. I don't know what an appropriate percentage would be, but 30%, 50%, that if the best bid is, say, more than 50% above our city estimates, that we just do it in-house. Because I think we have to find some way to rein this in. I mean, we're figuring based on our estimates, and if indeed this is correct and the estimates are wildly below what the actual cost is, because these companies are taking advantage of the fact that the city doesn't have internal competition for it. I don't know if this is ever done, but it seems like an appropriate way to do it, to say, okay, you don't have to bid at what we estimated, but if it's too ridiculous, we shouldn't even consider it. So if nobody comes in under 50% more than what we've estimated, then we just don't take it out. We just do it in-house.
At some point, you probably would want to do some sort of a cost-benefit analysis of in-house tree trimming versus contract tree trimming. Some of the discussion has been that the cost of contract tree trimming has increased. There's also discussion about the quality of some of that is not as high as in-house. But in order to look at this, you probably want to have some sort of an analysis on the costs of both and make some determinations about which is the best way to go. You can have that come back as a report and consider it. And then make some decisions as to the type of tree trimming program you want for the city based on some of that analysis, and it should take into not only the cost but the quality.
But in the meantime, could we not just say we're not going to be ripped off, and we will not allow any contracts that go 50% above the city's estimate?
If contracts come in too high, they can be rejected.
But we could just give that direction now, so people would know, don't bid 100% over the city's estimate. Here's what your range is.
It also may be an operational issue for street services. Currently, they don't have crews in place to trim trees other than to do emergency tree trimming. So it may be an operational issue for them to say, if bids come in too high, that we're going to give it in-house. They may not have the staffing actually in place to do that. That's actually a question directed to street services, if they can accommodate that. If they can accommodate that, it is certainly within the ability of the Board of Public Works at any time when they get bids for tree trimming contracts, that if the bids come in too high, they can reject the bid and make a determination at that time, to the extent that there is staff available in street services to take that work in-house. But I believe, though, it has been an operational issue for them. They just don't have the staff to do it.
And what you may want is to have some sort of a plan come back. Take a look at this, do the analysis, bring back a plan, and if the desire is to move toward rebuilding the crews and having that in-house, then you can move in that direction and have a plan to do so. And also, incidentally, part of the discussion during the committee was that there are a number of departments that do tree trimming, and you might want to look at some sort of coordinated effort and make this a broader issue on the tree trimming program. What kind of a program we want? Who do you want doing it? And that.
There are all sorts of longer-term policy issues. I'm just wondering if we can find a way in the short term not to get ripped off. I mean, even if we just said, in the first 3 months of the fiscal year, we will not permit any bids over 50% of our estimate. If it doesn't happen, then we don't trim trees for 3 months. And then we just catch up later in the year. I don't think someone will notice that we're doing a huge amount of tree trimming, even if it's over 9 months. $4 million is pretty much a drop in the bucket anyway.
And that may be something you would want to ask the Bureau of Street Services or even the Board of Public Works to take a look at.
colleagues, any thoughts on this idea?
My thought is that I think we do need to take a comprehensive look at consolidating our tree trimming services and expanding them, to be sure. I think that is kind of the first order of business, because until we do that, it's going to be harder to reduce the amount of contracted services until we staff up our own crews to do it. And I think so long as we have the ordinary contract approval process and they have the ability to reject contracts that are excessive, it may be that there are instances when because of shortages, because of excessive wind, emergency reasons, heavy demand or something, that they have no choice but to contract, and the market drives the rate up. I just don't know enough about it to presuppose what that limit should be. That I kind of feel more comfortable ensuring that our managers manage and do what they're supposed to do on that. But if the direction that we're going is to move more of this in-house, I'm totally in agreement with you that that's an important priority.
Right. Well, I certainly agree with that. I'm focused on something entirely different, which is just in the short term, how can we stop getting ripped off by these contractors? So maybe we could just give direction to ask the Public Works Board to take a look at this issue. I think if they experimented with being a little tougher on their bids, I don't think there's a big downside if we slowed down tree trimming, contract tree trimming for the first few months of the year, because we only got incredibly high bids. I don't see the downside to that. We certainly could make up for lost time in a relatively short period of time for such a small amount of money anyway. But it just irks me to see contracts where people have paid more than twice what we've estimated would be a fair price. So clearly contractors are taking advantage of the city and the lack of competition from city workers.
Can we ask for, would you like to ask for a report back from Street Services and Public Works to this committee with a proposal for how we might minimize excessive contract costs?
I think that would be great, and at the same time encourage them on their own to take a tougher stance against these incredibly high overcharges from my point of view.
Okay. Colleagues, any objection to doing so? Then that will be the action of the committee as well. Mr. Englander.
Nothing on small technical corrections. Yeah, I think in terms of PD hiring, I know that my colleagues had a lot of questions on that too, and as well as the overtime bank. And I'm sorry, wanted to just have a discussion if we could on PD hiring and the overtime bank. And I know I want to yield it to my colleagues because I know there's a lot of questions that others had already opened up and said that they had. So we can start with those.
Okay. Okay. Members, police hiring. Any? Let's start just with that. The one change. Let me just maybe I can set it up a little bit. We've changed the definition of the item in the UB to include additional police hiring and also. What was the language?
It was to include detention officers.
Detention officers. Correct. So we had a significant amount of discussion in the committee. We had an informative report dealing with the cost comparisons between civilian detention officers and having police officers serve in that role. And it seemed clear from that reporting that there would be significant cost savings involved in replacing the police officer personnel in the detention capacities with civilians in order to allow those police officers to go back into police work instead of jail work. And by doing so, even without hiring an additional officer, we would enhance the available resources of the police department. And so that 3.2 million or so, I think 3.2 million was set aside in the UB for that.
In addition, we also have a report under a special study coming back on civilianization and ratios to officers, as well as technology enhancements on what can be digitized to further enhance or create efficiencies for officers as well, in terms of just having the raw numbers of boots on the ground. And so it's not isolated just on that line item. There's some significant requests and report backs and discussions that'll be occurring this year, and focusing on that, as well as the report backs on the overtime bank and how to manage that, as well as different thoughts on I think the word from Mr. Blumenfeld was to refinance it or look at that. There was a report back on that as well. Those are, I think, the deep discussions we need to get into rather quickly after this budget as well.
Yeah, and just to separate the two issues, the overtime bank itself is and how we stop it from continuing to grow, number one, and then deal with the anticipated cost of it over the longer term. That's one set of issues. The accumulation of overtime, though, is directly related to police hiring and police deployment, and whether we're keeping police officers in the jails instead of having them available for deployment on the street. So I think they are, to that extent, they're related issues. I think what I'm hearing, Mr. Englander, is that you're correct in reminding us that we have a lot more analysis of actual deployment needs based on reports back on civilianization, based on cost reductions that might be had by civilianization of the jail capacity, before we can make an appropriate decision about the degree of police hiring that would even be necessary to maintain current levels. Right? I mean, we have a certain anticipated attrition rate, but if some of that attrition rate can be dealt with by putting more officers into police work who are currently serving in an essentially civilian capacity, then that has the same effect as hiring new officers, maybe even better, because you have people who are already trained. So one thought, which I, offer for discussion, is until we move the ball forward in analyzing those issues relating to the need for additional hiring, we have money set aside for hiring to attrition right now in this budget. There's an additional some $3 million beyond that for additional police hiring. We've redefined this to also include the detention officers in that. If we were to move the entirety of that funding for police hiring into the UB, and then have a longer discussion about how best to utilize that, whether for hiring new officers, if so, how many classes, replacing officers currently doing civilian duties with civilians, have that longer discussion, but move all of that police hiring funding into the UB. That would be one way that we could address some of those issues.
If the committee were going in that direction, I wouldn't suggest moving it all and tying the hands for the next few classes. Those things are well underway. Personnel's already doing backgrounds. Classes, it takes months for the department to gear up for each and every class and go through that process. So if that is the direction that the committee would be going in, I wouldn't look at moving it all into the UB.
Okay. Well, is there? I mean, first of all, are there other thoughts? Because this is just an idea for discussion. But if that were the case, is there a way to allocate an appropriate percentage that would be necessary to retain for the existing classes that are already underway or about to be underway?
I would ask the CLA to weigh in on that, perhaps, if there's any recommendations, or the department.
course, if you wanted to fund the initial classes, if there was a desire to kind of reassess hiring during the year without slowing down hiring in the beginning of the year, I think that's what you're trying to get at. We can do a quick calculation, but just bear in mind that the July class, the August class are your most expensive classes. So while the cost that's included in the police department budget of $11.7 million, you're going to need a larger proportion of that because the earlier classes are more expensive. So it's not going to be exactly half, is my point. If you said put 6 classes in, it won't be half. It'll be probably 75% of the money. So,
right. And that's my concern of moving it all into the UB, because you've got July and August classes already set. Those things that are well underway and putting in the UB, this budget takes effect in July. And so they're more expensive because we're hiring them for a longer period of time, obviously. So with that, I think it is complicated, and that's why I asked the CLA to weigh in on it. If there were, I think we need to have the discussion and look at the reports that we've requested back. We've been talking about it budget after budget after budget. This isn't a new item, and really looking at that balancing and what makes sense, and getting the department as well as the Police Protective League and the command officers should all be weighing in on this. This is a very detailed and critical discussion that should occur, but all the stakeholders, I think, should be involved in it as well.
Yeah, and your point is well taken about not disrupting the existing pipeline, in part because by the time we could take any action on civilianization, on moving folks out of the jail, there would be some lag time, and you would actually have a drop in available resources until such time as those classes came on board anyway. So it probably makes sense to keep that pipeline for those initial classes going while we look at some of the longer-term hiring needs over the course of the fiscal year. Members, any other thoughts on?
I like your suggestion, except it doesn't sound like enough money would be left to accomplish as much as we would like in terms of civilianization. It's almost seems like a 2-year process for that to play out well enough, unless we put additional money into the civilianization part of it.
Well, but the flip side of it is, and again, I'll look to the CLA's office on this. If the initial classes are the most expensive because we're paying them for a larger percentage of the fiscal year. By the same token, if we were to hire civilian jailers because they would come in later in the fiscal year, there would be savings realized by the fact that they wouldn't be hired. So to some extent, there'd be some offset there. We wouldn't have to realize the full savings on the police budget in order to hire civilians at some point in the fiscal year. Where that ratio lands, I can't, I can't just spitball it. But generally there's there would be an inverse relationship there. What you lose on the one hand, you'd gain on the other hand.
In terms of talking about civilians as well, first and foremost, the word civilianization is not what we're talking about, just to be for technical discussion purposes. We're not talking about civilianizing sworn officers or hiring civilians to hire in lieu of. What we're looking at, from my perspective anyway, is civilianization being something completely different. It's civilians, though, that are support staff as well in the police stations, all those, the clerk typists, people that are filing reports, all the support staff that officers need. And that study that was asked for is coming back as well. So not civilianization per se. But having said that, yeah, this is quite honestly probably a 2-year, not discussion, but phase-in. If we're going to be doing something, it's doing something this year that would be ongoing, and not, quite frankly, not just 2 years, but looking for a detailed plan on, we've got to make sure that we have detention officers. We've got to make sure that we have support staff as well for officers to get them off of the desk and out into a car, out in the community. and they need support staff. And so in looking at that, I think that is going to take that kind of detailed analysis and discussion that we should that should take place, and that's going to take quite a few months to get there and have those discussions and go through the proper committee channels, bringing all the folks to the table, looking for all the report backs that we've asked for so we can analyze those and ask those questions and make informed decisions. That's going to take some time. If we can accomplish that in the next several months and it takes effect, it's my hope, and I think everybody's hope, that we do make some changes moving forward this year. They would certainly impact and affect and enhance, I think, the department for the following year as well. So I think it would, yes, a 2-year benefit, not a 2-year wait, and ongoing for that matter. But
so, Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Kretz.
Would it be appropriate to pick an appropriate amount of the $3 million and put that in the UB for civilianization?
Well, the $3 million is already in the UB, and the $3 million figure would take us from attrition level to 10,000 officers. Am I correct about that? And that to maintain attrition rate, we have $11.7 million that's budgeted for current fiscal or next fiscal year police hiring to reach attrition levels with a 360 officer attrition assumption. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So there's, if you take it all together, to get to 10,000, you know, again, the theoretical 10,000 number, given the fact that we have some of them performing civilian duties in the jail and otherwise, as Mr. Englander's pointing out, that would take $15 million. The 11.7 to get to attrition level and another 3.2 to get to the higher level. So right now there's 3.2 in the UB. There's 11.7 in the base budget of the PD. Correct me if I go astray here. So, is that correct?
Correct, right.
Okay, so the issue is, since the 3.2 is already in the UB, the issue is, do we take some portion of the 11.7 in the base police budget in anticipation of the feedback that Mr. Englander has been talking about and the further consideration of some of these fundamental policy issues of, you know, deployment? Do we keep some portion of that in the UB rather than putting it in the police-based budget? And to Mr. Englander's point, and thank you for pulling me back from that, because you clearly can't take all 11.7 or else we would disrupt hiring right in midstream. So we couldn't do that. But is there some appropriate number that we could do so that we continue the hiring apace for the first 6 months, say, and then we have a check back in, just as we've talked about doing with the fire department?
And here's one philosophical thing I would add. I would think that 10,000 officers would be fine with me as long as we considered civilian jailers to be part of that 10,000 force. I think we would be acting appropriately.
And that's part of, you know, this whole discussion, which is why that 3.2 has been redefined, so we can have that exact discussion about whether it's to be spent on uniformed officers or civilian detention officers or some combination of those things.
So in theory, we could do that without further direction at this point, because we've set the money aside for both purposes.
Yes, except that if there's a desire by the committee to take it a step further and address current scheduled hiring to attrition. Here's the thing. If during the course of the fiscal year you take the police officers out of the detention center and put them on the street, you're serving the same function as hiring an equivalent number of police officers. You're enhancing the forces that the chief can deploy in law enforcement capacity on the streets by that number of officers. But we don't realize any savings in doing that unless we reduce the number of new officers being hired by a like amount. Then we're just spending more. We're spending more for civilian jailers, and we're hiring additional police officers at the same time. So there's no savings realized there.
Right.
So in order to realize the savings, you have to deploy those resources out of the jail into law enforcement and then reduce by a like amount the number of new hires that you bring in. So that's what the discussion has to be. You know, if we're going to do that, if we're going to provide sufficient funding for hiring civilian detention officers, then we don't. The chief no longer needs to deploy police resources in the jails. So then the question is, what impact should that have on police hiring?
If I could.
Yeah, Mr. Englander.
If I could, I think, see if we can land this plane. There's a lot of discussion on looking at the variables that we're discussing, and there's a lot of different stakeholders that, quite frankly, I think need to have a seat at this table and input. These are huge decisions that, moving forward, the rest of the city family needs to weigh in on, and experts as well, including, by the way, the police commission. And so with that, I would ask that we fully fund what we have planned. The first 6 months go directly into their budget. The second 6 months of the year, however that calculation breaks out, and I know it's a trickle effect, go into the UB, and then we bring this back to this committee with all of those various stakeholders for detailed discussion when the reports are ready.
Second, great suggestion. Now, that being said, it's not going to be half of the 11.7, because presumably the amount to be sent to the UB would be significantly less than half because of this issue of the longer year. Mr. Blumenfield?
And I certainly agree with that proposal. I do think it's more complicated than we're letting it out to be, and to some extent, because as what I heard the chief saying was that it's not just about the number of officers. It's, well, it's sort of an insurance policy in terms of the number of officers that he has who are sworn officers, not necessarily just the officers who are in the detention center versus on the street. That there is some utility to having a certain number of sworn officers, and that's where it gets complicated, where by taking one person out of the detention center, putting another officer on the street, that doesn't necessarily equate to the same force capacity as hiring another officer. So I do think it makes sense to go the route we're talking about and get it into committee and get the stakeholders and the chief and other folks around the table, because it doesn't seem like it's a 1-to-1 ratio. There's definitely a savings, and in terms of the police force that we need, but it may not be 1-to-1.
Thank you. Mr. Bonin.
I completely agree with Mr. Koretz's sentiment and where he's coming from. However, I am incapable of refuting Mr. Krikorian's math. So I agree to and consent with Mr. Englander's recommendation. But and now I get to Mr. Blumenfield. Mr. Blumenfield kind of hit the nail on the head of what my concern has been forever. We don't have the right metrics in figuring out how we deploy cops. We have, for 6 or 7 years now, genuflected at every budget season in front of the big carved numbers that say 10,000. And I don't know if that's the right way to be evaluating whether or not we're doing the best job, getting the best bang for our buck with public safety. And we need to get a better sense of, are we doing more or less policing now than we were before we had 10,000 officers? And when we ask those questions, either the department doesn't calculate stuff that way, or we don't know, or be careful with that metric, we're told. And I think we need to be careful with looking only at the 10,000 officers. So, one of the special studies is a request of mine, 155, which asks the department to come back and have a discussion with us about better ways of analyzing how well we're doing with policing on the streets rather than just the number of cops on the payroll. Until we get that information, until we get that metric, we are going to have the same discussion every April and May. Do we do 10,000 or not? Do we, get into this false discussion about, civilians and cops when it becomes a zero-sum game, and it might not be. It might make more sense to have fewer than 10,000 cops if we can get a bunch of cops out of the jails or off desk duty and into the streets. But we never know. We're sort of in the dark on that every year.
If I can close it with one thing. I would ask that we bring this discussion to a joint committee of public safety and budget and finance as soon as those reports are ready, and we can start having those discussions, because I think you're all right. This comes up constantly and every year, and looking at that balancing act, but it's incredibly fragile, and it's the most important function we do as public safety, both police and fire. And so these discussions can't take place just during this process. So I would say we go ahead and move on what's on the table.
I agree. I'm happy to do that. I think that would be a informative discussion, and your proposal gives us adequate time to be able to have that without in any way adversely impacting on current hiring plans. So thanks, Chief, but that's going to be the action of the committee. Anything further, members? Mr. Blumenfield.
Small police-related items. One is very small and technical, which is recommendation 163 on page 19. It reads, and I think it's just a typo I didn't notice when we were meeting before, but instruct the Los Angeles Police Department to report back to the Public Safety Committee regarding efforts to address the disabling of digital in-car radios. And that should clearly read digital in-car video, not radio. And it's just important that we expedite this report. You know, we're spending, and I know that that's just a typo, but we're spending so much money on this program. We really need to expedite this report so that we don't have any, we don't spend all this money and have some issue come up with disabling or tampering and all that. So very, very minor but important little typo question. And then the other, so I assume that's fine to change. The other thing, on the overtime issue, I don't know how to go about doing this, but I worry that we're about to hit these step increases and sort of interest rate increases on a number of folks who are in the overtime bank. And I want to figure out some way we can instruct the department to focus on the highest liabilities so that in the first month of the year, first 2 months of the year, that we just don't miss an opportunity to pay out overtime liabilities that are about to increase in interest, so to speak. And I don't even know how big of a number that is, but it just sort of is probably a sensible way to do it, but maybe there's a way to add some language into it to make that happen. And maybe the CLA has a response. Or
there is monies in the UB, but we have no money in our budget to pay overtime.
But to get rid of the liabilities that are about to increase, or is there a way to prioritize those? As a cost-saving measure is one of them.
Councilmember
Go ahead.
I think that is a report. That's probably an instruction to the department with CAO to look at focusing on those highest liability areas. The funding for overtime is only in the amount of $15 million. It's presently in the unappropriated balance. By virtue of it being in the unappropriated balance, it would require a report back. If that is your instruction, that as part of the report back to focus on certain areas in the payout, that can certainly be done.
Yeah, I just don't want us to miss a window of opportunity in the first, because a lot of this stuff kicks in when, July, August, like the step increases that would increase the liability.
The step increases occur throughout the year.
Okay. I guess then we just add that as an instruction as part of the report back to focus on the higher liabilities, and particularly the ones that are happening in the first few months.
So to maybe get input from the department as to a strategy that will, with that same pay down amount, will maximize the greatest degree of long-term savings in overtime liability. Okay. Anything further on overtime, Mr. Englander? Or?
Got the reports.
Yeah. Mr. Bonin?
No.
Anything further? Anything further on any matter, members?
A couple on reports.
All right, Mr. Englander, go ahead.
Just on reports, so it appears we're done with the budget requests. Page 30, or I'm sorry, number 33. These are just technical corrections. I just have a couple. One is, I wasn't sure, I'm not sure whose report it was, but it's on attachment 1, page 4. Report number 33 is to instruct the city administrative officer with the assistance of the city attorney and planning department to conduct fee studies with the possibility of adding fees to create incentives for development. And so that's a little confusing. It sounds like we're adding fees to create incentives. You can buy an incentive. So I'm not sure exactly what was meant by that, or if somebody can explain that or reword
I
it.
believe that was Mr. Bonin's request.
Mike, do you remember?
What number was it?
That was number 33.
Oh, okay. All right, Laura, what item number 33? What I had asked staff to do was report back on what the feasibility would be of increasing development fees in areas of the city that have a high concentration of development. So the west side, for instance.
Okay. So would they be, when you say high concentration of development, do we have a definition for what that means? Or are you asking them to develop it?
Asking that as part of it. We saw in a separate report back, we asked planning to talk about where the planning applications are coming from. And I think we saw that Mr. Koretz and I, between the two of us, have about 40% of the applications coming in the city. So that would be an area where we're looking at maybe doing a higher development fee so we can put some of that back into cost recovery or more planning resources for those areas.
Got it. So it's not necessarily, it's the number of, I'm just trying to get my arms around, it's the number of applications, not necessarily the size of the projects.
Right. What I wanted them to look at is I want to be very sensitive to the idea that there are more council districts than not that are probably eager to get types of development in their district and are hungry for particularly economic development. So I didn't want them to come back with a proposal that would disincentivize development in the parts of the city that would need one, but could potentially capture a revenue stream without disincentivizing development in places that have an appetite that's more than overfilled.
Got it. Okay, well, it's your language. I would just ask if there's some way we can ask the CLA to perhaps capture that a little.
I think what you just said clarifies it, so
Yes.
that can be amended.
Excellent, fantastic. Thanks for that. And then on number 76, it was just on adding one word, and it's an increase in percentage. So it's instructing the Department of Disability to report on the Arts, Parks, Health and Aging River Committee and the Budget and Finance Committee on adding a performance metric. It says on the percentage of funding. It should be on the increased percentage. So we want to see the actual increase of their percentage of funding. We want them, there's a lot of opportunities for grants, and we want to see that percentage of their overall budget go up from grant sources. So I think that was the goal. All right, that's it. It was minor. That's all I have.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Englander. Members, anything further on the reports section, or for that matter, any portion of the CLA's report? Speak now or forever hold your peace, because I think we have come to the end of our consideration of the mayor's budget, members. So congratulations on a job very well done, and our thanks again to the CLA staff, to the CAO staff, to the mayor's budget team. I think, Mr. Kretz, you were absolutely spot on in speaking to the collaborative nature that this budget process has gone through compared to some prior years where we have not experienced that same level of collaboration. We appreciate it. Mr. Cole, thank you to you and everyone at the mayor's staff. Want to also obviously thank all of our own staff. Oh, sorry. I thought we were done. Maybe we're not quite done. yes. Actually, Mr. Englander, can you chair for a moment?
Sure.
Thank you.
All right, so this is what we're going to do. Everything that Mr. Krikorian wanted will redirect to CD12, and that'll be forthwith, without objection. That'll be the order. All right, the chair. Excellent, excellent. Thank you very much.
Articles of impeachment ever in order against an acting chair? Just articles of impeachment ever in order?
Believe me, they would be welcome, Mr. Vaughn, and they would be welcome. I do have one other request, which I'd like to add, and that is for building and safety. I'd like to ask that we add a resolution authority and 12 months of funding for 2 exempt positions for 2 project assistants and 1 non-exempt position, a management analyst 2, to address building and safety workload issues. The funding for those positions would come from Building and Safety's Building Permit Enterprise Fund, so it wouldn't have an impact on the general fund. And if there's no objection to doing so, members, that's the one additional change that I would propose that we make. And with that, I was kind of in the middle of, I think we covered all of our thanks at this point, but if any other members wish to speak, you may. Otherwise, Mr. Blumenfield.
I didn't make any comments at the beginning, so I thought I'd say something now, which is, in my long history as a city council member, this is the best city budget yet that I've been a part of.
But you know from budgeting.
But I wanted to thank the chair and all the staff members and the committee members for working with me and my team and helping us through this process as we put it all together. I look forward to working on this in the future, especially as we move toward the performance metrics. I think that's really important as we go in that direction, and that we sort of track and monitor the revenues. I mean, I see the way we're working with these projections and slowly learning this process, but it's, I think we've done a very good and collaborative process, and I'm very pleased with the collaborative effort, both with the mayor's office and all of the council offices, despite the fact that our collaboration is limited by the Brown Act to some extent, but just here in the committee room, being able to work together the way we have has been very productive, and I just wanted to thank you. So.
Thank you. All right. Well, members, if there's nothing further, I also do want to give a brief shout out to my Chief of Staff, Irina Brenosian, and my Policy Director, Matt Hale, who do all of this and make me, not fumble too much. So thank you both very much. And with that, members, yes, Ms. Calfine.
One minor thing. Could you adopt the CLA report as amended?
I guess we'd, thank you.
Wasn't that Irina and Matt's job?
There's always that.
So is there,
yes,
I'll entertain a motion to that effect.
Make a motion to adopt the CLA report as amended.
All right.
Yes.
It's been moved and seconded. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? That motion carries. Thank you, Ms. Calfine, and thank you all very much. Great work. And with that, we are adjourned.